Hello, everybody. I'm John Lassie. Today I'm going to be talking about one particular Mayflower passenger, John Howland. I chose to talk about John because he's my ninth great-grandfather, or rather, he's one of them. Theoretically, if you do the math, I could have as many as 1,024 ninth great-grandfathers. I say theoretically because in all probability the number is somewhat smaller. Given that the population in the area of Plymouth Colony, Massachusetts was relatively small, the chances that cousins might marry cousins in succeeding generations would be fairly high. Consequently, I could have several different ancestral lines leading back to John Howland and his wife, who was another Mayflower passenger, Elizabeth Tilley. Elizabeth was the daughter of Mayflower passenger John Tilley and his wife Joan, both of whom died in early 1621 during the first winter in America. John Howland's primary claim to fame is that he came within an inch of losing his life on the voyage across the Atlantic. During a particularly bad storm, John fell overboard. He had the good fortune and presence of mind to grab a rope and hang on long enough to be pulled back aboard. Most of what we know about John, and in fact about the Mayflower, the Pilgrims, and the early days of Plymouth Colony, comes from William Bradford, the second governor of the colony. His record, later published as Of Plymouth Plantation, 1620 to 1647, is the principal source of information concerning the people and events of that time. His first mention of John Howland concerns his rescue from a watery grave. In sundry of these storms, the winds were so fierce and the seas so high as they could not bear a knot of sail, but were forced to hull for divers days together. That is, take in most of the sails and drift with the storm. And in one of them, as they thus lay at Hull, in a mighty storm, a lusty young man, called John Howland, coming upon some occasion above the gratings, was with a seal of the ship, that's meaning a pitch or a roll, thrown into the sea. But it pleased God that he caught hold of the topsail halyards, which hung overboard, and ran out at length. Yet he held his hold, though he was sundry fathoms under water, till he was hauled up by the same rope to the brim of the water, and then with a boat hook and other means got into the ship again, and his life saved. And though he was something ill with it, yet he lived many years after, and became a profitable member, both in church and commonwealth. Bradford's use of the term lusty to describe Howland likely does not have any sexual connotation, but probably means lively or merry, although since John and Elizabeth had 10 children after their marriage in 1624, we can't be entirely sure of that. Not much is known of John's early life. We know that he was the son of Henry and Margaret Howland of Fenstanton in Huntingdonshire, which is just a little northwest of Cambridge, England. Here it is on a contemporary map downloaded from, rather contemporary nowadays, downloaded from Google Maps. He is believed to have been born around 1592, but the only evidence we have for this is a notation in the Plymouth Colony records regarding the date of his death, which was recorded as February 23rd, 1672, and which indicates his age at above 80 years. Some sources, however, say that this age was exaggerated. John's date of death is usually given as February 23rd, 1672/73. I'll explain that shortly. It's somewhat complicated. The girl John eventually married, Elizabeth Tilley, was born about 1607, a little further to the south and west in Henlow, Bedfordshire. John had two brothers, Henry and Arthur, who emigrated to New England after he did. They were not Puritans like John, but were Quakers who settled in what is now Marshfield, Massachusetts. At this point, I think it would be appropriate to explain a few things about the calendar and dates in England and its colonies in the 1600s. Until 1582, the Western world measured time using a calendar authorized by Julius Caesar in 46 BCE. Not surprisingly, it was called the Julian calendar. Under this calendar, a year was considered to be exactly 365 and a quarter days long. As with our current calendar, 3 out of every 4 years were deemed to have 365 days, with every 4th year or leap year having 366 days. In 730 AD, or CE in modern usage, it stands for the Common Era, Saint Bede the Venerable of the Kingdom of Northumbria is credited with discovering that the Julian calendar year was 11 minutes and 14 seconds too long when compared with the actual length of time it takes the Earth to go around the sun. But it took over 800 years before Pope Gregory XIII brought the calendar into sync with astronomical observations by dropping 10 days between October 4th and October 15th, 1582. The practice of adding 1 day every 4th year was kept, but was fine-tuned by providing that 3 out of 4 years, evenly divisible by 100, that is, the last years of the centuries, would be ordinary years of 365 days, with only every 4th centesimal year, that is, a year divisible by 400, being considered a leap year. Within a couple of years, most countries in continental Europe, the Catholic ones anyway, were using the new Gregorian calendar. However, Britain and her colonies, which had stopped paying attention to the Pope long before 1582, continued to use the Julian calendar until 1752. In that year, the government of the United Kingdom under George II adopted the Gregorian calendar and decreed that the day after September 2nd, 1752 would be advanced to September 14th, a loss of 11 days, thus bringing the calendar into sync with the rest of Europe. Perhaps more importantly for genealogists, in England prior to 1752, the end of each year was midnight, March 24th, rather than December 31st. For example, March 24th, 1700 was followed by March 25th, 1701. When Britain adopted the Gregorian calendar, New Year's Day was changed to January 1st. In order to minimize confusion arising from this change, for pre-1752 dates falling between January 1st and March 25th, genealogists generally indicate both years separated by a virgule. It's more commonly known as a slash. That's why John Howland's date of death is usually expressed as February 23rd, 1672/73, or sometimes just 1672/3. Without this practice, It's easy to imagine situations where people can become mixed up as to the correct order of events. For example, if the date a person executes a will is given as November 1692, but the date of death is given as January 3rd, 1692, as opposed to January 3rd, 1692/93, a researcher might tend to question the validity of the information. So let's get back to John Howland. Although we don't know much really about his early life, we do know that when he traveled to New England on the Mayflower, he did so as the indentured servant of John Carver. Carver was one of the prominent men among the separatists, as the Pilgrims were known. In fact, he was selected to be the first governor of the colony. The Pilgrims were called separatists because they believed they should worship separately from the Anglican Church, the state religion of England. Although John Howland has been described as an indentured servant, he probably wasn't of the menial fetch and carry sort. Unlike many young Englishmen of that era, he had some education. A number of books were listed among his possessions, and some sources indicate that he acted as Carver's personal secretary and right-hand man. Indentured servitude was quite common in the 17th and 18th centuries. It's been estimated that as many as 1/2 to 2/3 of the immigrants to the New World were under contract of indenture. It was a device particularly used by people of limited means in order to pay their passage across the Atlantic Ocean. This next slide shows an example of a typical contract of indenture during that era. This contract appears to have been dated in 1766. It illustrates for me how common the practice must have been back in the day. It's a pre-printed form which people could acquire and then simply fill in the blanks, with or without the aid of an attorney. It reminds me of the forms for standard leases or bills of sale you can buy nowadays at an office supply store. Generally, the period of servitude was stated in the contract. Typically, the period would run 4 to 7 years. During the period of servitude, the master was responsible for housing, food, clothing, and other necessities of life. At the end of the period of servitude, the master would typically provide the former servants with the means to get a start in his or her new life of freedom, a grubstake, if you will. Sometimes this took the form of land, sometimes money or other gifts. Other than the fact that he fell off the boat, we don't know much about how John Howland fared during the voyage of the Mayflower across the Atlantic. The voyage was long and difficult, and accommodations for the passengers were crowded and uncomfortable. We can probably assume that John, as their servant, was kept busy assisting the Carver family. By the time of the storm, which caused Howland to fall overboard, one can only imagine how squalid and smelly the passenger accommodations below decks had become. That may have been the reason why John felt the need to venture topside. The Mayflower's company had expected to settle in Virginia. After their arrival off the coast of Cape Cod, however, they realized that they were too far north. Initially, they tried to sail further south, but found the passage at about that time of year, November, to be too dangerous to attempt. Further, their supplies were running low, so they returned to Cape Cod Bay, anchoring near what is now Provincetown. Not all of the passengers on the Mayflower were separatists. Some of these folks, who were referred to as strangers by the separatists, began to get restive and claim that since they were not going to end up in Virginia as they had agreed, they had no obligations to remain part of the group. To counter this mini-rebellion, the separatist leaders decided that